frontline communities, which is typically African American people of color or low-income communities. And then another thing I wanted to point out before I get into a lot of the different programs that we work on is just to make an announcement is that this year the Environmental and Climate Justice Program has become one of the game changers for NAACP National. And what the game changers indicate is it's identifying that it's one of the major areas of inequalities faced in African Americans today. And the other game changers that have been a part of this list that NAACP recognizes: economic sustainability, education, health, public safety, voting rights, and political representation. These are the other major focuses on the national level. So the Environmental and Climate Justice Program has three main goals. The first, but no, I forgot. Okay, so we have three main program goals. The first one is reducing harmful emissions, such as greenhouse gas emissions. That's our particular focus. The second one is advancing energy efficiency and clean energy. And the third is strengthening community resilience and livability. And I can briefly describe what those are, right? So the first one we all know about reducing gas emissions. But advancing energy efficiency, clean energy. What can that entail? NAACP has a program called Just Energy. And that is how do we work with communities to make sure that there is economic energy resiliency and independence. And they have published a series of reports, one of which is called Lights Out in the Cold, Reframing Utility Shutoff Policies. And that's looking at communities that have shutoff policies, like England. And we find that to be environmental injustice, particularly for low income and people on pensions. And so it's something that National would like to see is that we get rid of that shutoff policy, particularly during extreme weather. There really shouldn't be energy disruptions during the summer, especially August, and during the winter months. Another thing is how do we reduce pollution from burning fossil-based fuel products and focus on clean energy. So we're in solar, having access to solar paneling, and of course weatherization. Low-income communities, typically the housing stock is older and do not have access to the funds or the loan programs to be able to upgrade the homes to make it a little bit more energy efficient. And so with communities of color, the energy cost is one of the highest costs for the household income. And so what do we do to lower those costs? Last year we worked with a few other community-based organizations to sponsor the Energy Provide Bill. And that bill is looking for funds to help bring solar paneling to low-income communities, schools, churches, and community-based programs. And the thought was, if we can get them off high-cost energy, get them on solar, and lower the energy costs, those savings can then be used for community programs, whether it's after-school programs for the school, and of course the homes would be able to have more money for food, clothing, and school supplies, those types of things. Another example, I'll give you an example of what is strengthening community resilience and livability. I talked about weatherization, which is an individual way, but what is another thing that we can do to make sure that our communities are resilient? That is working with our municipalities whenever they're talking about the emergency management plan. Low-income and African American communities are typically the last communities considered whenever in the case of emergency. We need to be at the table when they're making those emergency management plans, and make sure that the evacuation routes are clearly marked in our communities, and we have access to those resources. So that's one of the things that this program is trying to do, is trying to encourage everybody to become part, get to the table, because during an extreme weather event, it's too late. So move forward with our campaigns. I talked about a couple of reports, but let me talk about some more that we've done. Another one we've done is cold-blooded, put in profits over people. And how do we transition ourselves away from coal products, shutting down coal plants? I believe in Virginia we have about 3 or 4 still in operation. And so we're working with the branches in those communities like Richmond to be able to be part of that planning process as they're working on shutting down those coal plants and making sure that mitigation processes are there to clean up those environmental hazards that were placed. And in some cases, can we retrofit those infrastructure to make it into a community-based infrastructure that the community can start benefiting from? So those are the things that we're working on. I think my husband is starting to kick it, so I apologize for the wispiness. And then I kind of briefly talked about the IFRS, which is the Emergency Management Plan. Another one that National just published was fumes across the fence line. And that's looking at the fossil fuel-based projects. I always, it's like a tongue twister. And that is one of the first reports that ever really looked at the impacts these types of fossil fuel-based infrastructure has in African American communities and communities of color. And it provides a lot of really great statistics. For instance, it talks about how, on average, African American school children miss approximately 101,000 school days due to asthma-related illnesses. And we know how, when we know how, one, expensive that is to control, there are a lot of medicine that may not be covered. But two, it also put our children at a disadvantage because they're missing a lot of school. So that also helps to widen the opportunity gap for our children. So how do we make sure that we get these areas cleaned up and the medical services and programs to these children and the communities, whether, and our most vulnerable population are children and our elderly. So I try to look through, whenever I look at a scenario, I try to use an equity lens, and I try to ask these questions. What makes it unjust? Or maybe just, well, maybe it wasn't appropriate. So the equity lens, we're looking, oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. So the equity lens, we look at the outcome of the equity lens. So let's take, for instance, Hurricane Katrina. And we saw the food lines at the end, a couple weeks. Typically, the people receiving the services were people of color. The people providing the services were their white neighbors who were able to be resilient and were able to come back out to the community and give back. So we see that we have this issue. There was one population that wasn't as sustainable and wasn't able to bounce back as quickly as everybody else. And that indicates a systemic problem, right? We knew that the infrastructure in that area went years and years of the service and being poor. And we also know that the evacuation program was lacking. So what are these things that we need to do to make sure that these injustices do not happen? So we look at who thrives, who survives, who has issues bouncing back, who's more impacted, who are the collateral damages needed. They sustain the damages, but not the benefit. And who is legally liable and are they held accountable? Another thing that we look at is how are these resources being spent within a community? We look at one community that has access to Whole Foods and farmers markets. Another community that only has access to convenience stores with very high fat content, high sugar, nothing of nutritional value. Again, putting the children at another risk, development risk, right? So how are those resources spent and where are they allocated to? And then the third thing is who's making the planning decisions? Who's at the table? We need to see, is it representative of the population or is it very homogeneous? If it's a homogeneous, we're not on the agenda. So that's why it's really important for us to get on the table. And I have this I really need to get a big picture of this. But I don't know if you've ever seen that equity scale where it shows the people at the baseball game and they're trying to look over, and then they have like reality, equity, equality, and then liberation. Every so often it expands. Somebody actually came up with a plan that I think is very important, and that's called justice. And in this picture, they show that it was removing the fence, because that's really what the problem is. Because those other panels that I described, it kind of implies that the shorter person can't see, needs resources. But that's not true. The short person can see the game and doesn't need resources to see the game. The thing that's blocking him is the barrier. So if we remove those barriers, everybody is able to function on their own. And that's what this program is trying to do, is to remove those barriers to make sure the community and or the individual is resilient and sustainable. So that is what the output should be. Not something to supplement or to help. It's just remove it and make sure that they can function on their own. So what are some good environmental friendly, community sensitive guiding principles? Protect air, water, and land, equitable access to clean water, diverse mixture of alternative modes of transportation. We know transportation is one of the highest contributors for greenhouse gas emission and one of the highest costs in household income is transportation. Access to clean and healthy foods, very important. Affordable housing, clean energy, and or what I'd like to say is simply put, everything opposite that leads to a good life, or anything that creates harm or barriers. So I want to go briefly into a program that NAACP is very involved in, and that's Green New Deal Virginia. They've heard of it on a national level, but we've also brought it down on a state level. And we're co-chairing it, and I'm serving as one of the co-chairs of the Green New Deal Virginia. And what Green New Deal Virginia is trying to do is to reconnect the economy with the people, with the environment. We cannot continue to function and plan these things in silos. As we just described, the environment impacts everything. Access to quality jobs, it impacts everything. And social justice is that piece that covers everything, right? If you're not healthy, you can't go to work. If you're not healthy, you can't go to school. So your health is your wealth. That's the bottom line. If you're not healthy, you're in trouble. So social justice is a very important piece in the Green New Deal Virginia, along with jobs in the environment, of course. We're actually coalition building, and we're reaching out to various organizations. We have about 60 or 70 community-based organizations, and we also have elected officials and candidates. Delegate Lopez, he has been a champion of the Green New Deal Virginia from the get-go, and candidate J.D. Spain is also a supporter of the Green New Deal Virginia as well. And so when we've reached out to so many different other organizations, faith-based, community-based, unions, teachers, we're talking to everybody, because right now we don't know what the barriers are until somebody tells us what it is. And what Green New Deal is trying to do is figure out how to get rid of that barrier. So I have some handouts that's going to provide some more information. So I won't go into talking about the statement and read it word for word. But we have 9 working groups that have been working for the past several months that came with some legislation to help figure out how do we get rid of that barrier. And I'll go through them briefly, but we're getting ready to launch soon. We're just finalizing some of the things, so I don't want to go into too much because it's still a work in progress. But we have, like, for instance, a democratic governance group. So they're looking at how do we increase involvement in the democratic process, voting rights, how do we make sure there are no barriers to the poll. We also have another working group, which is sustainable jobs. Does that involve repealing right to work? Making sure that there's an ability to organize, those types of things. Another group, social justice and health disparities. How do we make sure that everybody has access to the things that they need to make sure that they maintain a healthy environment for themselves and their children? Another one would be food and agriculture. We strongly support local farming practices. And how do we use those farming practices to help us clean the air? Because there is a way with innovative agricultural techniques, carbon sequestration through farming practices. How do we make sure local farmers are able to do that and be able to maintain their land, right? How do we make sure our local farmers get their markets, their products to the markets? What are those barriers, and how do we fix it? Defossilization and energy efficiency, and kind of like what I went through, how do we make sure everybody has access to resources to ensure energy efficiency? And then healthier, sustainable rural communities. As Delegate Lopez had indicated earlier, the rural communities, they have their own issues as well. And how do we get to the heart of that to make sure that they can be sustainable, as well as our suburban and urban environments. That includes land preservation, that includes access to solar paneling, that includes broadband, and the like. And then healthier air, land and waters, pretty much everything. Moving away from harmful pesticides, single-use plastic products, those types of things. And then sustainable cities and transportation, access to alternative transportation modes, making sure we have access to sidewalks and those types of things. How do we make sure if you don't want to own a car, don't own a car? How do we address that in rural communities? That's another issue as well. So we're looking at all of those things. We may not get 100%, but if we're trying to be as aggressive as we can and as proactive as we can. And then there are going to be some issues that we identify that there might be some who's more advanced in this work. So we'll just work with them. We're not going to reinvent the wheel, but right now, we're just looking at the issues. So consider a three-circle Venn diagram: the economy, the environment, and social justice. Put them together, that's shaded center, that's the green wheel, everything intersects. And we think that's the root of the problem. So we try to make sure people understand that we can no longer move forward working in a silo. So when we talk about the environment, we say, well, to somebody who has more interest in jobs and or social justice, well, why is the environment important to the environmentalists? And we try to make sure that all of our three different thought groups understand what the other person needs and desires. And so with that, I think that is my presentation. So if you have any questions for me, I would be more than, before I do that, I'm going to hand out some information. We have a petition that we're going to try and get, once we get our packet together, we're going to be submitting it to all of our candidates and elected officials. But we also have a petition asking Governor Northam to work with the 2020 General Assembly to make sure that the Green New Deal is a reality. And we need as many people to sign on with us. The hyperlink to the sign on is there. We're planning a big event in October, so stay tuned. We have a Facebook page. Visit us online. I have for the Environmental Climate Justice Committee, we have a Facebook page online as well. And then I also have another handout that kind of talks about all of the different things that we've been working on for the past 2 years. We've been in opposition to the pipelines that we've been working on that, about how the pipeline, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Union Hill Compressor Station, as well as the Southside Connector and Hampton Roads. And we've been to events, and I've been talking to various elected officials trying to get support from these communities. And then there have been 2 really relevant resolutions that was passed during the national conference. The first one was proposed by President Derek Johnson. It was in opposition to hydraulic fracking. So national is in opposition to hydraulic fracking across the country. The second one is, which was proposed by the Fort Wayne, Allen County, Indiana branch, and this one also passed, where NAACP is currently taking it affirms environmental and climate justice work and takes a stand on climate change. And so we've been working on a lot of different things. And I also want to mention Save the Date Union Hill. They are having an event on September 7th to celebrate a lot of the things that they have been accomplishing. I think everybody here knows about Union Hill, which is the African American community that has been proposed for the Osiris compressor station by the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And so Dominion had approached them and said, we will help you as a community stay sustainable by coming up with a $5 million community agreement. And this community agreement was supposed to pay for upgrade the station to be able to handle those types of fires that compressor station would do. Hire 2 full-time fire people to fight the fires that they were going to start. And they were going to pay for that in a fire station in Dinwiddie. Not even in Buckingham. Yes. 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 So it wasn't even, it was like about 8 or 10 miles away from the compressor station. And also a community center, STEM program, STEM program, and a long litany item list of things this $5 million was supposed to do. So the residents of Union Hill said, we don't need Dominion to be resilient. We don't need them to be sustainable. So they went out and they found funding in which they were able to, and it was a continual program, but they've already trained 7 or 8 individuals on how to install solar panels. They've identified homes in which they're going to, in Union Hill, in which they're going to start putting solar panels on. So now that individual is going to have energy independence, right? And they found another grantor who gave them money to install rural broadband in one of the African American churches. They have been fighting this with their smartphones. They do not have internet service. Well, no, they do, because they brought it in themselves. So these are the programs that I think that we, as Virginia, as the Commonwealth of Virginia, should be supporting, or those projects that make the community resilient and independent, removing those barriers.
What has been your response as you've been out and going out and talking to legislators? What generally have their responses? And the ones who are opposed to this position, what's their take on why they're opposed to it?
Basically, it's out of my hands. It's decided by different agencies, the ones that won't do anything. Recently, we had a very strong letter that about 22 delegates and senators wrote in opposition to this pipeline. So there are people who are fighting for the Union Hill folks. It's just getting somebody to tell them to stop. For instance, Mountain Valley Pipeline, Attorney General Mark Herring had identified some violations about several months ago. They have about 300 environmental violations for the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And they continue to rack those up. And right now there is an unsafe situation in which they're now causing landslides. And they're taking trees out, which, the rooting system help stabilize the soil, which so they're making the entire situation worse. So I don't know what it's going to take for these projects to stop. In the Southside Connector, the construction of the pipeline is complete, but there are a lot of homes right along. What they ended up doing was they ended up building, putting these pipelines in people's backyards. And chimneys are now separated from homes. And they're being denied by Virginia Natural Gas for compensation to get their homes fixed. So it's like these corporations are coming in and putting in these pipelines, and these people, the communities, is left to try and figure out how to rebuild. And we can't keep doing that anymore. There has to be a way in which we can progress, we can protect our environment, and protect our people, and be sustainable. And this is what we really should be doing. And I'm getting my time is up, I think.
So Karen, could you just briefly talk about national and how, as far as the resources and how much money National is pushing towards the environmental and climate justice program, because I know it's a good sum of money, right? That's like a #1 priority for National, right?
It is a #1 priority, and right now, we're working with National to figure out what those programs should be in state. The Just Energy is one of their major campaigns. The working on closing the coal plants, and what we can do with that one's a really big one. And trying to figure out community solar. However, in Virginia, we have legislation that prevents us from community solar. We can have it on our homes, but we can't create little neighborhood co-ops.
Right.
And we need the legislation changed to fix that. And so that is also one of our major focuses.
So how can we, I know that there's a lot of data,
Yeah.
so I know that it was a big, it led a lot of data,
Yes.
so is there something that we can
Yes. And National has monthly conference calls for ECJ leaders, and I'm getting ready to set up some monthly calls as well. And so it would be great to have an ECJ committee in this branch as well. The more people on the ground, the better. And then there are things here in Arlington that we can be focusing on that have been going unaddressed just because the resources has not been there. So what we also need to do is figure out what issues in Arlington we need to look at. Is it affordable housing? In Richmond, that's something we're getting ready to launch. Is it flooding? Is it energy? Is there issues with HOAs that prevent people from having community gardens? Even it doesn't have to be this tremendously large project. It could be something small, right? Let's see, what are some of the things we could consider for Arlington? And that's one of the things that I would need help too, is help identifying what it is. Bridging the gap, connecting communities to the green economy. We need to look at stuff like that.
This last question, right?
Hello, Ms. Campbell. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's I'm Kate Crystal. I'm on the Arlington County Board. I'm so fired up about what we were talking about. We are just finalizing an update to our community energy plan in Arlington. And one of the tenets that we are putting in that is new when we created the plan 5 years ago is energy equity. We're trying to get the definition right. I'm getting copious notes following up to see the NAACP's definition is one we can borrow. But one of the questions I'd love your thoughts on, because I know this is really prime in the Green New Deal, is there is money to be made in a clean economy. And how do we make sure, and especially if you have any advice or recommendations at the local level, that when that money is made, it is done in an equitable way so that there is economic opportunity. Weatherization, for example, perhaps in lieu of policies that incentivize the creation of new energy efficient appliances that are probably going to go to our most well-off homeowners. So any advice that you have in terms of making sure that historically disenfranchised communities benefit when there are incentives or money on the table or money to be made in the transition to sustainability?
Some of the things that we looked at, and that's a good question, is how do we remove the barriers? And that could be in Virginia, nonviolent misdemeanors and felony charges stays on somebody's record. How do we get those removed? Because that prevents access to funding, it prevents access to training programs. So how do we remove that to make sure that our returning citizens also has equitable access to the opportunities? What are the programs can we include to make sure that people who are in between homes have access to shelter? Because that kind of prevents access to jobs, right? If you don't have a place to take a shower, you can't eat, you're going to have problems getting a job. So looking at, protection for indigents as well. And then of course healthcare. We kind of talked about that a little bit. And there's a lot of talk about how do we come up with punitive measures, whether it's financial for polluters. And where are those monies being spent? A lot of times they're like, we're gonna put the money in disadvantaged communities. But there's no tracking mechanism and there's no accountability to make sure those monies actually go to those communities. So that's a program to make sure those monies are actually spent to rebuild those communities that have been harmed for decades. Okay, you know, those kind of things. And also, as we're doing this mad rush to improve infrastructure, and it's always like, well, let's make sure we spend infrastructure in the downtown because it'll attract money, and then that money can go to the other communities. Well, no, because everything's moving at such a fast pace. We have to make sure the infrastructure is equitably placed, both in the downtown, the business, the commercial district, but also in communities, low income communities, right? I think everybody should be able to have the option of buying an EV, but if the infrastructure is not in the community, that's going to prevent you from saying, okay, this is an option for me. So making sure that infrastructure is there for equal participation. And one more thing, is it that we retrofit old uses to be able to accommodate that as well? That is something we can look at as well.
Well, thank you, Karen.